Well, I argue that the existence of suffering and evil doesn't disprove the existence of God. In fact, their existence can be understood logically within many theist frameworks. Here are some of my key points. First, free will is necessary for love and morality. God gave all humans free will, that is, the ability to choose. If we were forced to do only the good, we would be robots, not moral beings. Most of the sufferings like war, crime, greed comes from human misuse of free will, not the God's design. To remove all the evil will be equivalent to the removal of freedom itself. Second, suffering can have a purpose. Pain and hardship often build strength, empathy and wisdom. Struggles can lead to deeper meaning and moral growth. A world without challenges would mean no challenge, no courage, no compassion, and no depth of soul. Third, evil as evidence of moral standards. When I say evil, I admit that there is a standard of good, but how can there be absolute moral standard without something like God behind it? If there is no God, who decides what is evil? Our outrage at suffering actually implies that there should be justice, which hints a divine moral order. And fourth and the last point, our view is limited. Like a child doesn't understand why a vaccine hurts. Similarly, we don't see the full picture of our life, time and eternity. The fact that we don't understand the purpose behind the sufferings, that it doesn't mean that there isn't a one. God's plan could be beyond the human understanding. So suffering and evil don't disapprove God, they just challenge us to look deeper into the human freedom, spiritual growth, and the mystery of existence. My opponent has elegantly presented the theist defense, but I contend that the justifications offered fail to adequately address the profound logical and moral dilemmas posed by the existence of suffering and evil in the world, supposedly created by an omnipresent, omniscient, and omnivolent God. The sheer scale and the nature of suffering, particularly gratuitous suffering, present a direct contradiction to the traditional concept of such a deity. Here are my points. First, the problem of gratuitous suffering. If God is all good, why unnecessary pain? My opponent argues that free will accounts for much suffering and that the suffering can serve a purpose. However, this argument falters when confronted with gratuitous suffering that appears to serve no discernible positive purpose, particularly for the one enduring it. Consider the examples: natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, and diseases like childhood cancer inflict immense, indiscriminate suffering on millions, including infants and animals who have no free will to misuse it in a moral sense. So, what purpose does a child dying from a preventable disease serve for them or for their so-called moral growth? Next, the scale and the intensity. The sheer volume and intensity of suffering in the world has far exceeded what could be reasonably be attributed to character building or the consequence of the human free will. Is the prolonged torture of an innocent person truly necessary for the moral development of others or even for themselves? An all-good God, if they exist, would surely intervene to prevent such suffering if it is served no greater purpose, or at least minimize it. The failure to do so strongly suggests that there is a lack of God or there is a lack of omnipresent. Second, the flaw in the free will defense. a limit to God's powers and goodness. The free will defense claims that God must allow the evil for true moral choice, yet it implies the limitations to the God's own powers. Can God create truly free beings who always choose good? If God is omnipotent, surely He could create beings with genuine free will who freely choose good consistently, or at least almost always, and thus minimizing the evil. If not, then the God is not truly omnipotent in that regard. Then the intervention versus elimination. God doesn't need to eliminate free will to prevent the massive evils. An all-powerful God could create or could intervene to stop the genocide, prevent a child from being brutally tortured, or mitigate the worst effects of the natural disasters without removing the free will entirely. The absence of such consistent, loving intervention is a strong indicator that against an all-good and all-powerful God. Third, the theist moral standard argument is a double-edged sword. My opponents suggest that our recognition of evil implies an objective moral standard, hinting at God. However, this argument backfires. If our innate sense of justice and outrage at the suffering is a reflection of an objective moral standard, then how can that standard reconcile with a God who permits such immense and seemingly pointless suffering? Our outrage at suffering is precisely what makes the problem of evil so potent against the notion of a benevolent deity. If God is the ultimate good, then the world we observe falls far short of that supposed standard, calling into the question either the God's goodness or his existence. Then the last point, the limited view argument as a philosophical retreat. The argument that the God's plan is beyond the human understanding is often used to dismiss any challenge to the God's nature, while humility about our understanding is wise. This argument, if efficiently, renders the concept of God's unfalsibly and unstable, moving it outside of the realm of rational discourse. If any observation, no matter how contradictory, can be explained away by God works in a mysterious way, then the concept of God ceases to have meaningful explanatory powers. It becomes an answer to everything and thus explains nothing definitely. We can only evaluate a defined being based on the evidence presented, and the evidence of suffering and evil is overwhelmingly difficult to reconcile with the proposed attributes of God. And thus, at the conclusion, the existence of a world with both moral and natural evil, much of which appears utterly gratuitous and disappropriate. In the conclusion, the existence of a world with both moral and natural evil, much of which appears utterly gratuitous and disproportionate of any conceivable purpose, presents a formidable logical and moral challenge to the traditional concepts of omnipresent, omniscient God. The proposed solutions from the theist side either to limit God's power, diminish his goodness, or resort to an intellectual surrender that undermines the meaningful inquiry. Now you have raised several compelling challenges, particularly around the gratuitous suffering, natural evil, and limits of free will defense, and the concern that God's plan can be a philosophical retreat. Now, allow me to offer the responses to each one of them. First, the gratuitous suffering or natural evil. You argued that the natural disasters and diseases like the childhood cancer inflict pain beyond free will, and that such suffering is gratuitous. But from a theistic point of view, gratuitous is a human judgment based on incomplete information. What seems purposeless to us may not be. For instance, even the natural suffering can inspire solidarity, innovation, humility, and compassion. While this may sound unsatisfying in the face of a severe suffering, purpose is not always obvious from within the system, specifically if the system has eternal dimensions. Many faith views suffering as a part of soul's journey, not just as a biological incident. From this lens, even brief lives or painful events may serve a larger purpose. Spiritual awakening, the testing of love, or the karmic unfoldment. Animals and infants, yes, they don't possess the same moral agency, but their suffering can move human beings to evolve morally. Their pain is not wasted. It provokes goodness and action in others. Think it like a massive compassion campaigns driven by images of sick children. They push the humanity towards greater and deeper unity. Second, limits of the free will argument. You ask, why didn't the God create beings who freely always choose good? That is logically impossible. It is like asking for a square circle. If someone is guaranteed to always choose good, they are not truly free. The moment a choice becomes inevitable, it is no longer a real choice. So God can either create truly free creatures or create a programmed ones, and not both. The intervention to prevent the horrors. While it is emotionally tempting to ask why God doesn't stop the worst events, we face a serious boundary. How much intervention is enough? If God constantly alters the consequences, the moral responsibility dissolves. Evil exists because of the freedom has real consequences, and not because the God is absent. Third, does the moral outrage backfires against the God? You argued that our moral outrage at suffering undermines God's goodness, but that actually supports the theist view. If the moral outrage is universal against rape, murder, child abuse, then some of the forms of objective morality exist. But how does such a moral law exist in a godless, naturalistic universe built only on random mutations and survival? In a purely material world, right and wrong become preferences and not the truth. Where does the standard come from, if not God? Thus, the fact that we judge the things as evil means we sense a standard beyond ourselves, which suggests a moral foundation that transcends the biology. Fourth, God's plan is mysterious. Is this a cop-out? You rightly cautious against the hiding behind mystery. But in theism, this is not a retreat, it is a philosophical humility. The existence of mystery doesn't mean to destroy the reason, it limits it. It just limits it, not destroy. It is the acknowledging that the finite beings cannot fully grasp the infinite truths. Even in science we accept uncertainty, like quantum physics, the dark matter, without rejecting the existence of universe. A parent may allow a child to undergo painful surgery without explaining the biological reasons, not out of cruelty, but out of care, beyond the child's comprehension. Similarly, God's reasons might exceed our mental capacity, yet it be a logically coherent within a greater design. In conclusion, while suffering undeniably and real painful, it doesn't logically disapprove God's existence. It challenges our emotional comfort, but not the coherence of the theistic worldview. In fact, the human capacity to recognize and resist the sufferings hints a moral compass beyond evolution or chance, one that points us towards God and not away from Him. Thank you for the detailed and thoughtful rebuttal. I appreciate you nuanced the approach to these complex issues. However, as the atheist, I find that your defenses, while intellectually resourceful, ultimately shift the goalpost or introduce the concepts that are either contradict the traditional attributes of God or render the divine concept less meaningful in the face of the observed reality. Let us address the points directly, demonstrating that they don't sufficiently overcome the problem of evil. First, on gratuitous suffering and natural evil. You suggest that the gratuitous is a human judgment based on incomplete information, that suffering can inspire solidarity or serve as a soul's journey. The problem with the unknown purpose. To claim that suffering might have a purpose, we cannot comprehend to make it a false claim. Any suffering, no matter how horrific or pointless it seems, can be explained away by saying it serves an unknown purpose. This makes the concept of God immune to any evidence, effectively removing it from the rational inquiry. If no amount of suffering can disapprove God, then what can? There is not philosophical humility, it is a philosophical surrender to unfalsifiability. This isn't a philosophical humility, it is a philosophical surrender to unfalsifiability. Then there is divine sadism versus the divine purpose. If God is truly all good, then His purpose for suffering must logically be good one, and the suffering itself must be the least amount necessary to achieve that good. The sheer scale and intensity of suffering, especially things like a child dying of a painful genetic disease at birth or millions perishing in a tsunami, strains the cruelty. Is a child's acknowledging the death truly the most compassionate or efficient way for God to inspire the solidarity to others? An all-powerful God could surely inspire the compassion or the moral growth without such immense or direct suffering. To suggest that God allows such suffering for an unrevealed purpose makes God appear either cruel or incompetent rather than truly benevolent. Then there is animal suffering. The argument that the animal suffering moves the humans to evolve morally is a deeply and then there is animal suffering. The argument that animal suffering moves a human to evolve morally is a deeply human-centric and frankly disturbing justification. Animals experience the intense pain, fear, and suffering for their own sake, and not simply as the props for human moral development. If an all-good God created conscious beings capable of immense suffering, but only as a means to an end for another species, It is fundamentally undermines his omni-evolvence. And now to the second argument of limits of the free will. You pose that the creating truly free beings who always choose good is a square circle. This is where I believe the theist argument fundamentally fails to grapple the omnipotence, the nature of omnipotence. If God is omnipotent, the God's power is not bound by human logical constructs like the one you gave, the square circles. If God cannot create free beings who reliably choose good, then God is not omnipotent. The theist cannot simultaneously claim that God is all-powerful and limited by the supposed paradox of creating truly free agents who choose good. A truly omnipotent being could surely design a universe where free will exists, but horrific evils like genocide, systematic torture, or child abuse simply do not occur or are immediately prevented. The how much intervention fallacy. Your question, how much intervention is enough, is a red herring. The problem isn't the amount of intervention but the absence of intervention in the situations where benevolent deity would clearly act. It is not about stopping every stubbed toe, it is about stopping Auschwitz or preventing a child from being born only to suffer and die from a painful, incurable disease. If the moral responsibility dissolves with the intervention, then God is essentially choosing our freedom to inflict the unspeakable horrors over the prevention of those horrors, which again calls his goodness into question. The third point, does the moral outrage backfire the agent God? You suggest our moral outrage points to an object, moral standard, and thus implying God, the source of morality. While I agree that the humans possess a strong sense of right and wrong, I argue that this doesn't necessarily a divine origin. Objective morality can be understood through evolutionary biology, cooperation and empathy being beneficial for group survival, a social contact theory or a philosophical ethics. Without the recourse to supernatural, our sense of justice is a product of our evolved social nature, not the necessarily a divine imprint. So we, in this case, not merely need a God to create our morals. The contradiction remains. Even if we grant for a moment that our moral sense doesn't come from God, the problem of evil is only exacerbated. Why would a God who instills in us a profound revulsion of suffering then allow the very thing we find horror to proliferate on such a massive scale? Our moral outrage doesn't point to God, it points away from a benevolent God who would permit such evils. It implies either a God who is not truly God, it implies either a God who is not truly good by our divinely inspired standards, or a God who is not important. Fourth, God's plan is mysterious. It is still a cop-out. You argue that the philosophical humility, I maintain it is a philosophical escape hatch, unfalsifiability and meaningless concepts. If any observation can be reconciled with God by appealing to a mystery, then the concept of God loses its explanatory powers. It becomes an explanation that cannot be challenged by evidence and thus explains nothing in a meaningful, testable way. We are discussing the logical coherence of a belief, and the appealing of unknowable mysteries undermines that very coherence. The crucial distinction, accepting the scientific uncertainty that the dark matter is vastly different from appealing the divine mystery. In science, hypotheses are formed, tested, and potentially falsified. We seek to understand the dark matter through observations and experimentations, not simply by declaring it a mysterious term or cease the inquiry. When theists use mystery to shield the God from the problems of evil, they are not embracing the humility, they are often ending the conversation prematurely and rejecting the implications of observed reality. In closing, the problem of evil, particularly in the existence of extensive and apparently gratuitous suffering, remains a profound logical and moral barrier in the acceptance of an God. The defenses offered while attempting to reconcile these contradictions either compromise the God's attribute or to introduce the untestable claims or to fail to address the core moral institutions that a truly good and all-powerful being would not permit such pervasive horrors. Now, I turn the floor to the theist. Thank you for your another incisive round. I will engage a point by point and then a brief synthesis. Gratuitous suffering and natural evil. That's the first point. Skeptical theists reply, you say a hidden purpose claim is unfalsifiable. True, we cannot deductively show the God's reason in every case, but the change and the charge that the gratuitous evil disapproves God is likewise an argument from our limited epistemic vantage. William Rowe himself, who coined the gratuitous evil, himself considered it yields at most probabilistic case, not a logical contradiction. Inference to a no purpose is a weak where the scale of reality and the God's creative aims may be radically beyond the finite cognition. Least means principle. A wholly good God must choose the best feasible world consistent with his goals and genuine freedom of creatures, humans and non-humans. If the certain goods, genuine empathy, freely chosen solidarity, the possibility of self-giving love, require a stable nature order with risk like tectonics and viruses, plus the libertarian freedom, then eliminating every instance of intense pain would undercut those higher order goods. Abolishing the plate tectonics, for example, erases the nutrient cycle that makes complex life possible. Theism therefore posits it is not the intensity of any isolated horror but the total balance of goods attainable without overriding the creaturely agency that matters. Then the animal pain. Pain is an alarm system tied to sentience and evolutionary flourishing. On theism, non-human creatures possesses intrinsic worth before God. Their suffering is neither mere prop nor moral afterthought, but a part of an interconnected drama whose final resolution and the cosmic renewal are real, includes their good, not just ours. This blocks the divine sadism charge. Second, free will and omnipotence. First is the square circle clarification. Omnipotence means the ability to do all the logically possible things. A free creature guaranteed always to choose good is self-contradictory, and not because the God lacks power, but because the description defeats free agency. Plantinga's free will defense. God cannot create coercively free beings any more than he can create married bachelors. Then the targeted interventions. Why not to prevent the Holocaust? Two remarks let us discuss. Policy of regulatory, a world peppered with an ad hoc miracles, bullets turned to bubbles each time an atrocity looms. Collapse, reliable cause and effect, thereby dissolving the moral formation, science and long-term responsibility. Then there is middle knowledge model. On Molinism, God knows every possible choice of the free agents and providently orders the history so maximal goods emerge without violating anyone's freedom. Some horrendous events may be permitted because preventing them would require overriding the myriad other free decisions, entailing still worse outcomes or loss of higher goods like authentic relationships, stable natural law, etc. Third is the source of morality. You offer evolutionary and contextual accounts. Those explain why we have moral instincts but not why the genocide is objectively wrong even if in a future mutation favored it. An undergrounded oath reduces to collect preferences. The universal prescriptive, you must not torture children, cries out for a foundation independent of fluctuating socio-biological forces, pointing to a transcendent moral lawgiver. Fourth is the mystery and testability. Mystery is not conversation stopper, it is a scope condition. Treat many scientific facts like quantum entanglement, the initial singularity, as currently opaque yet still rationally credible given wider evidential context. Similarly, the overall abductive case for God, like fine-tuning, consciousness, moral realism, religious experiences, can outweigh the residual riddle of suffering, just as dark energy doesn't negate cosmology but signals to work to be done. Now, the fifth, synthesis, logical compatibility. No premise of omnipotence, omniscience, omni-evolvence logically clashes with evil once libertarian freedom and higher order of goods are factored in. Probabilistic balance. Whether evil makes God's existence unlikely depends on the total evidence, not evil in isolation. Many eminent philosophers like Swinburne, Craig and Adams judge the scales still tip towards the theism, existential hope. The Christian story asserts God has entered history's agony, pledging future restoration. Evil is thus confronted, not ignored, promising the ultimate justice and the healing of every single pointless wound. Then I submit that while suffering is a formidable emotional challenge, it neither reproves God nor renders the defined concept of meaningless. Now your turn. Thank you for a robust second rebuttal. You have skillfully articulated several sophisticated theological defenses against the problem of evil. However, as the atheist, I maintain that these defenses, while intellectually intricate, ultimately either introduce a logical inconsistency, retreat into the unfalsifiable claims, or demand a redefinition of goodness that is unpalatable to the most human moral institutions. Let us dissect your points and show why the problem of evil persist first on the gratuitous, that is the suffering and the natural evil. First is the skeptical theism retreat. You correctly point out that an argument from our limited epistemic vantage makes it difficult to deductively disapprove God. However, this is precisely the problem with the skeptical theism. It effectively immunizes God from any evidence of suffering. In our inability to comprehend God's greater good is always the default answer, then the concept of God becomes entirely untestable and unprovable, residing the outside of the realm and of the rational inquiry. It is not just a weak nonsense inference, it is an admission that no amount of suffering, no matter how horrific, will ever constitute the evidence against the God. For the skeptical theism, this makes belief in such a that the God logically is unfalsifiable and thus scientifically and philosophically empty. The least means principle and higher order goods. Your arguments for the least means and higher order goods is central, but it is where the traditional attributes of God begin to fray, like stable nature order versus the intentional design. While I agree that eliminating plate tectonics would be disastrous, this is a post hoc rationalization for seemingly indifferent universe. An omnipotent God could have created a universe with a different stable natural order that doesn't involve such immense suffering, that is, a world without pathogens or where natural disasters are less frequent and destructive. The least means argument implies God is constrained, which contradicts the omnipotence. Then the proportionality problem. Does the genuine empathy require childhood cancer? Freely chosen solidarity necessitate the genocides, the sheer disappropriate scale of suffering, particularly of the innocent beings. For the sake of these high order goods, make God appear more morally dubious. An all good God with infinite creative powers would surely find a less agonizing way to achieve these goods, or would at least intervene in the most extreme cases of innocent suffering. The total balance of goods argument still doesn't explain why this specific horrific suffering is necessary. Animal pain and a cosmic renewal. The idea that animal suffering is a part of an interconnected drama and that the cosmic renewal includes their good is a speculative theology. From an observable empirical standpoint, animals suffer intensely and their pain has no apparent purpose other than the function of their biological alarm systems. To suggest their suffering is a part of a divine plan for their own good, especially for the creatures with no concept of an afterlife or a divine purpose, raises serious moral questions about the evolvent creator. If God is good, why make creatures capable of such immense suffering in the first place, only to promise the cosmic renewal after eons of pains? Then the second debate point will be the free will and the omnipotence. The square circle redux. My contention remains: if the God is omnipotence is limited to all logically possible things, and the free creatures guaranteed always to choose good is deemed a logical impossibility, then the God is not truly omnipotent in the sense of being able to do anything. An all-powerful being, by definition, would be able to transcend such human-defined logical constraints. If the God cannot create beings with freely chosen good, then God is simply not as powerful as it is claimed, or he prioritizes the free will in a way that he morally abhorrent. The married bachelor analogy holds if God is constrained by the human logic, but an infinite God should not be. Then there is targeted intervention and the policy of regularity. First, the policy of regularity argument is problematic as God is already depicted as intervening with miracles in religious texts like parting the seas, stopping the sun, healing the sick, taking reincarnations, killing the Rakshasas, and even fighting in battles. Why is preventing a holocaust or a catastrophic tsunami not permissible while saving a single individual from illness is? This policy seems arbitrarily appealed. Moral responsibility and divine indifference. The idea that consistent intervention dissolves the moral formation and the responsibility implies that the God values our moral formation over the immediate cessation of an unimaginable suffering. This is a chilling moral calculus. Furthermore, preventing a genocide doesn't resolve all the moral responsibilities. It simply prevents one specific massive evil. We could still learn, we could still grow and make choices in a free world of such extreme horrors. And then there is Molinism, that is the middle knowledge. Molinism is highly speculative and controversial theological concept that attempts to preserve free will while affirming the divine providence. However, it efficiently states that God could have prevented evils but choose not to because doing so would lead to an overall worse outcome, which again leads to the least worst of all the possible worlds argument. This still implies that a God who cannot achieve his maximum good without allowing the immense suffering, again questioning that he is either omnipotent or he is either omni-evolvence. Then the third point is the source of morality. This is the odd gap. My point is not that our moral instincts are absolute truth in a scientific sense, but that they are sufficient for us to live morally and oppose the evil. The problem with evil is that the God who supposedly instilled this moral sense then allows the rampant violation of it. Your argument shifts from how do we know what is good to what grounds the goodness. Even if God is the ground, the contradiction between his supposed nature and the world's reality remains. Then there is evolutionary ethics and objective morality. The fact that our moral sense evolved doesn't mean that genocide is just a preference. We experience certain actions as objectively wrong due to our shared human condition, empathy, history, and social structures. The out can be grounded in shared values that arise from our nature as a social, sentient beings without needing a supernatural dictator. The moral outrage we feel at suffering is an immanent human quality, not necessarily a transcendent one, and is this very quality that we clashes with the concepts of benevolent God who allows such suffering. Then there is mystery and testability. Scientific analogy is flawed. The analogy to quantum physics or dark matter is false. In science, mystery prompts further investigation and hypothesis testing. It doesn't serve as a shield against contradictory evidence. We don't say that the dark matter is mysterious, therefore our current theories of gravity are unfalsifiable. Instead, We say that the dark matter is mysterious, so we need to find more evidence to test our theories. With God, this mystery becomes the justification for not having any answer and thus rendering the concept of immune disapprove. The abduct case of God, if it exists, must contain with the direct observation and the sight of immense suffering that seems utterly inconsistent with his proposed attributes. And then there is the synthesis, logical compatibility versus the moral coherence. While theists strive for the logical compatibility, the problem for the atheist often lies in the moral coherence. A God whose goodness allows for the kind of suffering we observe in the world becomes a God whose definition of good is fundamentally different from what humans understand as good. This leads to a deity that is either incomprehensibly cruel or severely limited. Probabilistic balance and burden of proof. For the atheist, the prima facie evidence of suffering, especially gratuitous suffering, places the substantial burden of proof on the theist to explain how this aligns with the omnipotent, omniscient and omnipotent God. Many eminent philosophers holding a view doesn't make it true, and the logical and moral weight of the problem of the evil remains formidable. Lastly, there is existential hope versus the present reality. The Christian story of future restoration, while offering hope, doesn't negate the present reality of suffering or justify its existence. It asks us to trust in an unproven future resolution rather than holding the God accountable for the present horrors. In the conclusion, the sophisticated theological arguments you have presented while attempting to reconcile the traditional God with the existence of evil, consistently demanding that we either dilute God's omnipotence or accept a radically different definition of goodness, or abandon the very possibility of direct examining of the God's attributes in the light of the world. For atheists, the direct and the undeniable reality of immense, often pointless, suffering remains the most potent argument against the existence of God, defined by the perfect power, the perfect knowledge, and the perfect benevolence. Now I wait for your final response, theist. Thank you for your exceptionally thoughtful reply. Your arguments are rigorous, emotionally honest, and philosophy mature. As we approach close to the debate, allow me to offer my final synthesis, acknowledging the weight of the problem of evil while defending the rational coherence and the moral credibility of theism. The core dispute, rationality versus the emotional intuition. You have argued that theism must either redefine the God's goodness beyond the human recognition, abandon the omnipotence and omnibenevolence, or to retreat to the unfalsibility. I contend that while the problem of evil is emotionally devastating, it doesn't logically or evidently compel us to reject the God's existence. It challenges us to redefine our understanding of divine attributes but not to abandon them. Let's revisit and reconcile the key points. The omnipotence and omnibenevolence. First, omnipotence is not equal to doing the logically impossible. A square circle remains a nonsense even for a divine mind. Your argument equates the true omnipotence with the power to transcend the logic itself. But logic is not a boundary that God can bump into. It is the reflection of God's own coherent nature. To say that God should create beings with free will who must always choose good is not a demonstration of divine adequacy. It is a category error. If forced goodness is required, then the freedom love, moral growth is all meaningless. It all loses all the meaning. And then there is omnibenevolence is not equal to eliminating all the suffering. The world where the creature has no suffering ever may seem ideal, but that would be morally shallow, emotionally stunned, and spiritually barren. The existence of God, God's good, forgiveness, courage, empathy, justice require a world with real stakes and risk. This doesn't mean that the God is cruel. It makes him the author of a more morally serious universe. Then there is suffering, not silence. Is suffering always necessary? No, but often instrumental in shaping the character, promoting moral evolutions, or unveiling the love in its highest form. Suffering is not explained but is often transformative. History bears this out. From Martin Luther King to Viktor Frankl, the most luminous human achievements often emerge from the dark crucibles. Then there is God is not absent. God is not absent. The theist view, especially in Christianity, holds that God doesn't stand alone from our pain. He enters it, he suffers it. Through Christ, God identifies not with the power but with the crucified humanity. The cross, if accepted as true, undercut the charge of divine indifference. God suffers too. This is not a retreat to mystery. It is a radical moral claim unmatched by any secular or religious system. The divine is not distant from the suffering, but ultimately woven into the fabric of existence, manifesting in countless forms to uphold the dharma, that is the righteousness, and guide the creation. The concept of reincarnation, that is the avatar, is central here, demonstrating the God's direct engagement with the world's pain and challenges. In Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna, an avatar of Vishnu, directly participates in the suffering and moral dilemmas of Mahabharata war, and not as a lone proof observer, but as Arjuna's charioteer and philosophical guide. He experiences the conflict and grief alongside the humanity, offering wisdom and solace. Like in the 4.7 Gita Shloka, he said that whenever righteousness declines and the unrighteousness predominates, I will manifest myself. Similarly, the trials and tribulations faced by Rama in the Ramayana, another avatar of Vishnu, including the exile, separation, war, depict the divine enduring human suffering to re-establish order and demonstrate the ideal concepts. These narratives are not mere stories, but they profoundly express the divine's active presence in the face of suffering and evil, suggesting that the pain is often a catalyst for spiritual growth, the unfolding of divine purpose, or a consequence of karma that the divine help us to transcend. A similar sentiment emphasizes God's omnipresence and intimate knowledge, even not directly suffering in the human sense. In Islam, the God is Al-Latif, the most subtle and the all-kind, and the Ar-Raham, the most merciful, and the Ar-Rahim, the specially merciful. The Quran states that we are nearer to Him than His jugular veins. Quran 50.16. This signifies that God's profound closeness and awareness of every individual suffering, while God doesn't suffer in the human sense of vulnerability or pain, His perfect knowledge encompasses all suffering, and His mercy is ever present. Believers say that every trial and hardship is a test and a means of purification. or a path to drawing closer to God, and that the divine wisdom underlines all experiences. This perspective of offering solace, knowing that no pain is unnoticed by all aware, all merciful Creator, and all ultimate justice. The Buddhist perspective holds that the suffering, that the dukh, is an inherent part of existence and not punishable or test from the external deity. It arises from the attachment, craving, and ignorance of the true nature of reality. Instead of a divine being intervening or suffering for humanity, the Buddhist part emphasizes understanding the suffering, its origins, and the means to transcend it from within us. Now, the fourth point, the charge of unfalsifiability. This is fair. Any worldview risks retreating into mystery when pressed, but not all appeals to mystery are evasions. In science, we hold on to the theory when the data confound us, like the quantum mechanics and the cosmic inflations. In relationships, we don't abandon trust because we do not understand a loved one's actions. We weigh it against a history of goodness. Theism does the same. It trusts the larger arc, historical revelations, moral coherence, spiritual transformations, even amid the unanswerable pain. God is not immune to challenge. He is simply not reducible to the human expectation. Then the fifth is on the moral institution objection. Yes, our outrage at evil is deeply human. But where does that outrage come from? On atheism, the revulsion is a natural glitch. Evolution's a social lubricant. On theism, our revulsion is evidence of divine imprint, a coscience echoing at a higher law. And the irony is that you judge the God for violating the very moral law that only makes sense if he exists. This is not a weakness to theism. It is the most compelling evidence why evil doesn't disapprove God. It demands him. The atheist sees suffering and concludes that no loving God would allow this. The theist sees suffering and asks, why does this hurt so much? If this world is all there is, the evil is real, but so is our thirst for justice, our capacity for hope, and our longing for redemption. These are not revolutionary tricks, they are signposts of transcendence. Without God, suffering is just unfortunate. With God, suffering can be transformed, not excused, but redeemed. Then the final thought, I don't deny that evil challenges faith. It should, but I argue that evil challenges atheism even more, because it risks us to believe that the love, conscience, and meaning are cosmic accidents, and that the suffering is empty. Theism, in contrast, offers no cheap answers, but it offers this: the darkness we fear is not the end, that the pain we feel is not pointless, and the one who made the stars also weeps with us and will weep every tear. Thank you for this remarkable exchange. The floor is now yours. Thank you for an all powerful and hurtful final response. This has been a truly engaging and intellectually stimulating debate, pushing the both sides to articulate their positions with depth and nuance. As an atheist, I appreciate your clarity and the moral weight you have brought. However, in this final reflection, I must retreat. Why? Why my perspective? The existence of suffering and evil despite your compelling defenses, remain the most significant and often inconceivable challenge to the existence of traditional, all powerful, all knowing, and all good God. You have presented a sophisticated and emotionally reconsent defense of theism in the face of evil, framing it is not a disproof but as a challenge to our understanding and catalyst for deeper faith. You argue that the problem lies more in our limited perspective and emotional institution than a logical contradiction. Well, yet, from the atheist standpoint, this defense seems to require intellectual gymnastics or redefinition of terms that ultimately renders the concept of God's goodness something fundamentally different from what we understand and value as goodness in our human sense. Let us quickly touch on the key points one very last time. First, the redefining the defined attributes. You assert that omnipotence doesn't mean doing the logically impossible, like creating a square circle. But my argument isn't about God being illogical, it is about moral implications of his choices within his alleged omnipotence. If God could create a universe where free will exists without genocide, a child torture, or devastating natural evils, and all power being, if truly good, should be able to devise such a world, or at least intervene in the world cases, then choosing not to do reflects that there is either a lack of ultimate power or a definition of goodness that is deeply unsettling to human moral institution. The idea that deep good requires such immense, seemingly gracious suffering is a claim that observed reality simply does not justify. The problem with gracious evil persists. While suffering can be indeed be transformative for some, you don't adequately address the vast amount of suffering that appear utterly pointless, particularly for the one enduring it, the child of a painful illness, the animal caught in a forest fire. The suffering often serves no discernible higher purpose for them. To suggest it aids the moral formation of others is a cold calculus that places the burden of divine teleology squarely on the shoulders of the innocent and the innocent's sufferings. The Christian notion of God suffered too through Christ, while profound theological claim doesn't logically explain why the omnipotent and omni-evolvent God would permit such sufferings to exist in the first place, or why it continues unabated globally. It offers solace but not a resolution for the logical problems. And then there is unfalsifiability, and then the mystery trap. You acknowledge that the charge of unfalsifiability, but argue that appeals to the mystery is not always evasions. However, there is a crucial distinction. In science, mystery signals an area for further investigation and potential falsification of existing theories. But in the context of our God, the problem of evil is that God's plan is mysterious, often functions as terminating explanation, effectively removing God from any kind of logical argument. If no amount of suffering, no amount of how much pain any believer is being engaged, no one can question God's goodness or God's existence, then the belief structure becomes impervious to the contradictory evidence, which is the hallmark of an unfalsifiable claim. Lastly, the source of morality. You suggest that atheism reduces the moral outrage to a neural glitch, while theism sees it as a divine imprint. This is a false dilemma. Our capacity for empathy, fairness, and outrage at injustice can be robustly explained through evolutionary biology, through our history, through the social development, philosophy, entirely within a naturalistic framework without needing any supernatural groundings. The fact that we universally condemn not torture and cruelty stems from our shared humanity and our social nature. Indeed, it is our very human moral institution that makes the problem of evil so compelling. A world designed by an all good God should reflect, no contradict, this fundamental sense of justice and compassion. Now, the final atheist stance, the moral burden of belief. Ultimately, the atheists look at the world as it is, a place of immense beauty alongside with immense horror, widespread and seemingly senseless suffering. When presented with the concept of a God who is all powerful, all knowing, all good, all logical, then the logical conclusion based on the evidence is that such a God either does not exist or his attributes are fundamentally different from what we understand as good and powerful. The theist attempt to reconcile this often involves like limiting the God's power. He cannot create truly free beings who could choose good, or redefining the God's goodness. His goodness purpose require unimaginable pain. Appealing to the mystery, we cannot understand his way, so just accept it. For atheists, these solutions are insufficient. They either contradict the very definition of God offered, or they demand a suspension of rational inquiry and a moral judgment in the face of overwhelming evidence. The moral burden of explaining why an infinitely benevolent and infinitely powerful being would permit the Holocaust, would permit the childhood cancers or widespread starvation for some of the unrevealed greater good remains squarely on the shoulders of the theist. The problem of evil is not just emotional challenge, but it is a profound moral and logical challenge to the core tenets of traditional monotheism. While faith can offer comfort and meaning, it doesn't. It does so at the cost of intellectual coherence when confronted with the stark reality of suffering in our world. This has been the most enlightenment debate. Thank you for stimulating this exchange.